Chapter 7 Fruit 12 years before the events of Team Gold. "You did what?" The commanding officer in charge of Vacchio's occupation force had not been kind to Ashpenez since he started volunteering. It was only out of respect for his father's career that he overlooked his first offense, but this was crossing a line. "I saw an abandoned child and took him to safety," Ashpenez repeated without insult or emphasis. "That child," the CO spoke with emphasis, "murdered half your squad with a Grimm's tooth! Why did you think this would be a good idea to bring this thing in contact with more people?" Ashpenez allowed a moment to pass before he drew breath to respond. He was cut off before he had the chance to voice the same response he had given the first time. "Just explain this report to me. I need to know why he stopped fighting." Ashpenez shrugged. "I looked at him and he stopped panicking. He seemed a bit naive, but I could tell he was a good child. The eyes are the window of the soul, you know." The CO let out a long sigh and ran his hand through his beard. "I appreciate the work you're doing for us, young man, as I do your father's interest in bringing his research facility here, but this is too early to start taking risks. If you found this thing—" Ashpenez cut him off. "The child," the CO continued. "The child came from the same place as the Grimm and sure started acting like one the moment it came in contact with people. You were the exception, and I needed to know why." Ashpenez considered the reasonable nature of the CO's concerns, but found himself without any answers beyond his conscience. His response came with the goal of favoring the young one as his standard and goal. "I can only affirm what we already know. Around me he is no threat. I propose that he remains with me until such a time as you can determine him as much a threat as the rest of the children we are picking up." The CO acknowledged the emphasis on his final point. He had taken in dozens of orphans a week, traumatized from bombing runs, Atlas raids, and the constant threat of the Grimm. The fact that so few of them had responded to human interaction without hostility was the real surprise. The question was how someone who couldn't have been more than 10 years of age could have accomplished as much as he did with so little. They all had their theories, but only one remained standing before him in spite of every reason to cast him aside. "We saw the child hiding in the midst of where Grimm spawn into this world. We saw the child hiding in the midst of where the Grimm spawn into this world. I believe it was only his semblance that allowed him to survive." The CO maintained eye contact with him another moment. "And you're sure that's actually what it was?" The phone on the CO's desk rang, and he moved to answer it. Ashpenez maintained his posture at post unless told otherwise. Yet his eyes followed the body language of the CO to travel a journey paved by surprise. "Send him in," he finally spoke, and hung up the phone. Taking the stance of a salute, Captain Nebo entered the commanding officer's quarters in full A-class uniform. Given how prone he was to making his point by appearance, it was clear that he was trying to assert authority by his visit. A very tall young man accompanied him in civilian clothes. "At ease," Nebo spoke, allowing the CO and Ashpenez to both relax. "Is there something wrong here, Lieutenant?" The CO shook his head. "No, sir, just trying to make an informed decision." Nebo nodded in respect for his candor. He was not an authority here. The Atlas government made sure to communicate that. Yet regardless of how things were done across the forces of Atlas, they weren't machines here. The culture of the nation they were charged with occupying had rubbed off on them, even to the end of the war. It would be almost as amusing to see how the Vacchio representatives would behave, given their exposure to Atlas's culture. Seeing the warranted concern on the CO's face for the lives of his countrymen, and his adopted son's concern for the latest child he discovered, he attempted the role of a mediator. "What do we know so far?" The CO handed him the reports. "This much, sir. 5 dead." Looking over the reports, he turned to Ashpenez. "And is there anything you would add to these reports?" Ashpenez thought for a moment and shook off what he knew was a moment of doubt. "None." Raising an eyebrow, he made a very subtle gesture to the other person in the room with his eyes so as to not gain his attention. "Sir," Ashpenez finished, Putting the papers down, Nebo took a stance of an officer giving orders and addressed the CO.
I propose a solution. You're not to disband an asset to Vacuo to babysit and counsel. The chaplains can fulfill that role.
He turned his head to meet Ashpenez from the corner of his eye.
But, given the nature of his semblance, it seems like good company produces good character. To prevent further loss of life, he will accompany Daniel until the opening of the new school and proper evaluations can be made.
The CO broke discipline to glance back at the young man that accompanied him. Daniel? The way the man's eyes reacted to his name revealed he had the constitution of a boy. Further examination only confirmed his suspicions. He was like a giant who didn't know his own strength. Whatever was happening with the black-eyed boy, they apparently had that much in common. He didn't have many reasons to trust the child, or this newly introduced individual, but he knew Nebo well enough not to question his judgment. I will sign on the order. Nebo shook his head.
You're in charge here. If you trust my judgment, then make it your own, and we'll share the consequences.
With a moment of lucidity, he turned to look at Ashpenez and Daniel one last time. Permission to speak, Nebo waved his hand.
Granted, what do you need to know?
The aura of authority had left him and returned to his natural stance of a quiet but collected scholar. Please don't make me regret this, the CO said with the last stroke of his pen. Ashpenez gathered the papers, and they all saluted each other. As the small group left the office, Daniel's eyes continued to dart from sight and noise with no shortage of temerity. When one cause for concern came close enough to examine, Ashpenez took the time to take it and show it to the boy as no threat to him. With the assurance of his voice in particular, Daniel took the shiny tool and began testing its weight.
What do you call this?
Ashpenez made a mock gesture of ignorance and returned the question.
What would you call it?
Nebo looked at the exchange in light of everything he had been through to get to this moment, and smiled. Current day. Daniel rushed to protect Leia as she stood dumbstruck by the sight before her. A force of unrestrained wrath and fury came barreling down at her like an avalanche, leaving her helpless as she was made fully aware that her voice was its cause. Her eyes were fixated on the black pools of Gideon's eyes as she looked in them for the restoration she had been seeking as her answer to the pain she was carrying. Yet the more she searched for that familiar opportunity to grow, this was the first time she only saw him within. She saw anguish. She saw desperation. She saw the same animalistic panic and absolute despair that haunted him when they had recovered him from Salem's castle. A fraction of a moment had passed, yet the shock to her system seemed to make everything around her move in slow motion. Daniel was moving closer, and Olivia was chambering another shard into her rifle, yet her attention remained entirely on Gideon. She had finally gotten what she came here to find, and instead of consolation or comfort, she saw what stood before them all and was left mute. In the face of such overwhelming pain doubled back and barreling down on her, only two words could form from every single memory and hope that coalesced in her mind.
I'm sorry,
Leia whispered before Gideon's blow struck home. Leia's aura shattered, and the blow itself sent her flying backwards a full 15 yards before she instinctively took a rolling position that prevented any lasting damage to her anatomy. The ripple of force Gideon's attack left on the air pushed Daniel back and almost cost Olivia her balance. Leia began checking her range of motion and found that there wasn't a single bone broken from the exchange. Her aura was destroyed, but her specialty was maneuverability anyway. Her combat instincts had been ingrained into her as little more than a reflex and got her to act even as her mind was still overwhelmed by the sight they all saw. Daniel was trying to get Gideon's attention and hopefully calm him down, but despite her seeing them make direct eye contact, smoke only continued to pour out from his face as if he was back at Abimelech's camp again. Daniel moved to knock aside one of Gideon's blows from his unmarred hand and saw him shatter his last human appendage to match the stones that engulfed the former.
Oh no,
Leia whispered as she built herself up to a shout.
Daniel, don't hurt him, it's only making him worse.
Daniel couldn't take himself away from Gideon's onslaught to roll his eyes, but the message was apparently understood before it was spoken. Her eyes went to Olivia, who nodded and began to put distance between them and their target. She ran to reach the farthest end of the canyon wall only to see an ever-growing collection of yellow eyes emerging from the darkness. Her semblance would be useless as her fear gave away her scent like blood to water. She began taking shots into the unknown and hoping to buy them time. Daniel caught one of Gideon's claws and began to roll him over his shoulder to lock him in an armbar on the ground. Unable to be restrained, Gideon waited until the maneuver had been completed and snapped his elbow in reverse to break his state of submission. The stones moved to reverse the damage done as his semblance pushed him further and further into a state of frothing madness. The roars echoed through the canyon as more and more Grimm began to gather to observe. Leia tried to take everything in and make a decision given necessity, but she saw no way out. The only factor she could consider that offered them any hope was that the Grimm hadn't charged yet. They seemed to be waiting for something and only sought to prevent their escape. An idea came to her mind in spite of everything and began to give orders. "Olivia! Daniel! Threshing floor!" Daniel paused for a moment before trying to subdue another one of Gideon's blows and used the moment of respite to nod to his wife. She primed her rifle and took aim at his chest as he prepared himself for the blow. Holding Gideon's hardened arm a moment longer, he jumped and released him in anticipation for his legs to bound off of his body to propel another counterattack. The shot let off, and Daniel's semblance flared with enough force to propel Gideon farther than he intended to go. His aura began to flicker, and a piece of his breastplate fell off from the blow. Yet the maneuver had been completed. Gideon had been thrown into the onlooking Grimm and began pulverizing anything that came within reach. Olivia ran to check on Daniel as he fought to keep himself on his knees rather than falling breathless to the ground. Leia moved to meet them and was met by Olivia with a slap to the face. She considered the gesture justified until Olivia began to speak over the chaos around them.
"That move was your idea."
Daniel wheezed a small laugh and tried to gesture her to come closer. Olivia wrapped her arms around her and moved Leia to be within arm's reach of Daniel in order for him to pat her head.
"I'm sorry,"
she spoke again as Daniel and Olivia continued to comfort her.
"There was no way you could have known,"
Olivia said. Daniel nodded and moved to raise himself up.
"We need to get out of here."
They all began to look around for any possible route available to them. Gideon was content thrashing the Grimm around them, but remained an ongoing threat even under the assumption he was able to annihilate the Grimm that stood in their way. The canyon walls were too high to jump, too smooth to climb, and too inconsistent to be thrown to. The more she examined them, the more she realized they had found themselves in the dried and barren remains of what was once a river that no longer had any source to sustain it. Olivia wasn't going to leave Daniel behind, and Leia wasn't considering it a possibility anyway. They had put themselves into a meat grinder and could only hope that a window opened for them to avoid their turn through the tunnel along the way.
"Does anyone know we're here?"
Daniel shook his head.
"I left instructions that we were the extraction. I only hope that the message got delivered."
Leia's ears rose up.
"The instructor knows?"
Daniel nodded.
"I told your landlord to report it to him."
Her ears went down at that. Nothing more needed to be said.
"What about Nebo? He knows we're here,"
Olivia said. Leia shook her head.
"He knows we left. My ship is destroyed, and unless yours is around the corner."
They all looked down. Olivia reached out for Daniel's arm for comfort. Daniel moved to receive and provide what she needed. Leia's knees began to shake and dropped her knives to the ground. Yet before her knees buckled, she saw the loose wires that bound her knives to her wrist and quickly looked up to meet Daniel and Olivia, who had already noticed what she had.
"What do you need me to do?"
Daniel said as she began unspooling the wires to their limit.
"The only way we're getting out of here is if you're the one pulling us up. I can wrap these around you and Olivia will pull on you once we have them anchored."
Daniel let out a small laugh.
"So you're both doing the heavy lifting this time."
Leia couldn't return the gesture as she went through the math in her head.
"These are going to hurt."
Daniel laughed harder as he finally got his breath back.
"It wouldn't involve me if it didn't."
He put his hand on her shoulder and nodded.
"You're all worth it."
Olivia finished the last of her work on the razor wire and wrapped it around the ends of her rifle. She handed the gun to Daniel after revealing the blade, prompting him to hurl it as close to the top of the canyon as he could. Nodding at the rifle being deep enough to fully submerge the barrel, He took Leia's harness and gloves to wrap around his arms as the girls climbed onto his shoulders. They each took a knife and wrapped their legs around his shoulders before he began to activate the retraction function. Being designed for the weight of one woman, the mechanism whined in protest at the pressure put on it by 3 people. They each worked in kind to embed a blade into the rock surface and allow Daniel 2 or 3 steps up before the machine was forced to take their full weight again. Quick examinations were made to the state of the rifle, which was undoubtedly struggling against the cords sharp enough to cut through a Grimm's hide. Yet Olivia's ingenuity, Leia's quick thinking, and Daniel's willingness to put himself in harm's way for the sake of his friends all coalesced into one final effort to preserve their lives. Once they were above the canyon, they could travel the same route Olivia had made with a clear goal in mind of where their ship was waiting. 20 meters was a very short distance, but an incredibly difficult journey when facing bloody arms supporting the weight of 2 women, who in kind were putting a very large man's weight on their wrists to buy themselves a half a step forwards. Yet they continued to climb, trusting each other to accomplish exactly what they needed to. A bright beacon of hope shined from their hearts, rendering them all but invisible to the Grimm around them. They made 2 more cycles before sharing a smile between each other, as the rifle that anchored their ascent in place was almost an arm's length away. This beacon faltered as the rifle's purchase within the wall began to shift, releasing a rock from beneath its place. Gideon's consciousness, after the searing pain inflicted by his own hand, fell into a pool of blackness so absolute that he imagined it was what it was like to naturally fall asleep. Time and place became afterthoughts as his existence became the foundation of perception to what was and wasn't around him. Within the void, the water around him seemed to drain away and replace itself with a source of light that manifested before him in the shape of a man, with large drake's horns, revealed itself with his back turned to him. He looked down to see the black fluid that had engulfed him moments before had also taken a form behind him that he could not turn to meet. Past what he now perceived was his shoulder, a voice spoke in a language he didn't quite understand. Understand was the wrong word. He recognized them as words, but he couldn't remember their meaning. He wasn't there to speak, and so he hadn't been given the faculties to do so. Whatever spoke at his back from the void, it was appealing something to the shape of a man before him. The tension seemed to increase as he noticed a pattern in the noises, suggesting he was asking him the same question over and over again. The being behind him continued to speak before a long and sharp noise broke through the pattern of appeal to the man of light. It was then that the man transformed into a crystapel that unfurled itself in a pattern of erratic movements before slowly coming to rest before him. Under his gaze, he felt all the things that were lacking in the company of the first being he was immersed into were fulfilled. He could now understand, yet nothing was said. He could now remember who he was, but not what ultimate purpose it served. He could now feel the regret of his life cut short, but the eyes of the one who would hear the answer for his actions could not provide absolution in judgment or justification through mercy. They could only look upon him in pity, as the aura that represented his life merely served as a preservation of the image he created man to reflect. His shape and form were blackness and void, encapsulated and contained by a frame of light. The being he was couldn't find peace where his nature was intended to, yet the light reflected by the being before him kept him from being absorbed back into the nothing from whence he came. He understood now what he was, not a living thing or a mindless monster. He was an abomination, an attempt for the darkness to meet with the light as another attempted insult, not unlike what he experienced when he shared the witch's soul. The words of the destroyer could now be heard and understood under the gaze of the Creator.
"Is this creation, brother?"
The words were spoken in his own voice as a mockery of the image he looked upon with love. Yet powerlessly he could only gaze upon Gideon a moment longer before he was forced to look away. A being that was supposed to be called a god was powerless to grieve the machinations of his equal and contradiction. The blackness consumed him once again as he felt sucked away from the presence of the one who gave his existence its purpose and meaning, forcing him into a state where the emptiness was so absolute that a cry of defiance as strong as the universe itself would merely be a ripple in the ocean by comparison. Then, in a moment, time bound itself to him again. A moment to experience the despair that now was his existence became known to him, and the thick soup around him began to swell and move with a form it hadn't for all eternity. It wasn't like the black fluid anymore. It had actually become black fluid. The sensations of cold and heat, confusion and purpose, reality and dreams suddenly became distinct, and he realized what was happening. He was drowning. If he was drowning, that means he was alive again. Should this have taken place a moment or a lifetime sooner, it would have been a hope for a future worth living, a second chance to see what his rashness had robbed of him and those around him. Their faces returned to his mind as he could only imagine what he had put them through after taking his own life. 2 words formed in his mind as his rebirth resounded to the open air, but all that came out was a scream. He couldn't see apart from shapes and various shades of light. They all hurt him to look upon, but one in particular caught his attention the most. The outline was irrelevant. All he understood in the midst of the blackness and various flashes of light was a being in pain. A sensation of loss overtook him to the point where it threatened to bring back the sensation he felt when the Creator turned his back on him. He could not endure that again, and used every fiber of his being to snuff it out. Whatever the source of this painful light was, he was going to extinguish it if it was the last desperate act he was capable of in his new existence of shouting shadows and weeping lights. Another light contained within a large shape moved him a direction he did not intend to go. This confused him at first, but only caused further irritation as this new light gave him the sense of confusion and doubt. The utter refusal to believe what stood before him was actually there. He didn't know the shape, only that the light made him feel a sense of desperation that reminded him of the void. He would snuff this out too, if only to escape that inevitable reality. It continued to deny him the chance to reach its source until he was sent yet another direction he did not intend, among other shapes, with no light, but the same desperation to end it that he felt. It was then that he realized they saw a light in him that made him furious. The sensation reminded him of the being at his back when the Creator refused to acknowledge him. They frightened him. He would break their shapes to find that light and remove it from his mind. Every motion, exertion, and attempt to stop their presence from recalling to his mind that moment of absolution was met with another and another and another. He didn't want to exist in this state, but so long as he did, he would pursue what semblance of peace he was capable of experiencing until someone snuffed out his light too. It was a long time before the shapes stopped appearing before and around him. He could tell more were on their way, but for now it was quiet. This mercy did not last, as one light that didn't necessarily hurt him so long as he looked away from it became blinding and excruciating to be near. It imprinted on him the same memory of when he first fell into the void, where the destroyer met him. He would do anything to escape that encounter from happening again, and anything that reminded him of its inevitability must end. He used every ounce of strength to propel himself closer to the shapes that produced that light, even for a moment, and shoved his arm full force in and through its chest. It was then that he finally woke up from his living nightmare.
Daniel!
Olivia shrieked as his sternum erupted in a shower of bone and gore, revealing Gideon's stone claw in its place. The mechanism that kept them all where they were caved in on itself as its foundation lost its grip on the wires, leaving them both hanging by the knives they still had embedded into the solid rock. Leia's muscles compensated by the sudden shock and grief that watched as her friend fell to the fruits of her misplaced hope. She turned to Olivia, seeking some desperate attempt to take responsibility and comfort what she undoubtedly was experiencing as not unlike what she felt the moment she understood what had happened to Gideon. Yet as she turned, there was nobody there. Olivia's strength had failed moments before her own, and they both closed a distance in moments what had taken an hour prior to cross. The fall wasn't serious, but the state they were all left in as a result of it was fatal. Not only were they trapped with Grim closing in at every corner, but in immediate danger of the one who had cut them off from their last hope for escape. Her aura had shattered long ago, but her semblance would hopefully keep her alive long enough to find and be with Olivia and what was left of Daniel before the end. Olivia had tried making her way to Daniel's body, heedless of the fact that Gideon was still there with him and growing more hostile by the second. Leia moved to grab her and prevent her from going any closer. It was then that she noticed she still had her knife. Looking around for where the other might have fallen, she realized it had not fallen with her and was completely out of her reach. She made eye contact with Olivia and through tears nodded as she tossed the blade to her in order to accomplish what needed to be done. Olivia disappeared and moved on Gideon before he was able to get to his feet. As the two circled him from either direction, Gideon's dark eyes searched for and locked on Leia as she closed the gap. In a moment where she anticipated the blinding speed and crippling pain of his claws, he merely paused and watched her move. Her pace slowed slightly as he got to his feet in order to meet eyes with her. The all-too-familiar chill of his semblance, observing and echoing her soul, took effect as the smoke in his eyes finally dissipated. For the first time in her life, she saw the color of his eyes. They were green, with a faint ring of blue circumventing the edges. She had finally slowed to a full stop mere feet from him, as he stood fixated on her, and she to him. With a brief glance down to his bloody claw, he followed her gaze and reacted in horror. The sharp breath that saw Daniel's corpse at his feet drew into his lungs like one waking from a nightmare. He looked like he was trying to speak, but the only thing that could be produced from his body was a single tear in reaction to all he saw around him. Olivia peered behind him with a gaze that spoke of rage she was rightly feeling, and nodded to her. Gideon sensed her presence and seemed to want to react to it, yet he remained rooted to where he was. He kept his eyes on Leia, who stood before him with her knife in hand. Gideon noticed it and leaned forward slightly in a gesture of invitation. Her friend was in pain. She could see the constant contact with the cursed rocks that had all but engulfed his body at this point were torturing him with his own semblance, and no future could be had for him that could be distinguished from a Grim. Olivia nodded back to Leia and took up Fire Branch to shatter the back of Gideon's leg and forcing him to his knees before her. Taking up the knife and maintaining eye contact with him as much as possible in order to keep him docile, she saw the stones that crisscrossed his chest move against one another as he drew in a purposeful breath. As the memories they had all shared and the soul-crushing pity at each of their current state passed between them, they amplified themselves more and more until the collective despair they both saw in what was shared between them reached its crescendo. "Goodbye," he finally said as she pressed the knife between the stones and into his chest. Gideon's eyes fluttered and closed as his skin darkened and reduced themselves to ashes before her. Her knees buckled once again, but out of conscious grief rather than trauma and shock. She turned to Olivia, who discarded the hammer and was hesitating to put her hand on her husband's body. They both saw one of his arms move up to meet Olivia's, and she quickly moved to take it. Havilah moved to examine the injury and recognized the exit wound had taken one of his lungs with it. He wasn't going to last long. Yet in a state unable to take a complete breath, Daniel mustered up the strength to look into his wife's eyes one last time, and smiled. She returned the smile as much as she could and placed her hand on his cheek as her permission to let him rest. His eyes closed and remained smiling until the last of his strength left him. She leaned on his chest sobbing as she felt him grow cold. The Grim announced themselves to them in their grief and began to close in from every side. Leia took up the knife and saw it had broken in half upon its final use. She moved herself between the monsters, with the shattered blade waiting in her right hand. With a fire in her eyes, she prepared to defend the only friend she had left, knowing she had nowhere left to run.